Call Her Daddy is or was everyone's all-time favourite podcast, but the recent two-part series Alex did giving Jamie Lynn Spears a voice on her large platform did not sit well with her fans. Call Her Daddy listeners were not happy at all with what they heard, and since the two-part series, Alex, the face of Call Her Daddy, has received so much backlash. She is currently taking a break and apparently she's going off to France. She doesn't even know if she'll ever be able to interview or do any more podcasts in the future because of the state of how much backlash she's currently getting. Alex is freaking out, so much to the point where she just made a short-ish update podcast explaining that she's cancelled. The podcast was called Cancel or Call Her Daddy, and I listened to that podcast and her two-part series with Jamie Lynn, so you didn't have to. So the first part of her most recent podcast was addressing her getting cancelled because of the hate she received for giving Jamie Lynn a platform to share her side of the story about Free Britney and the conservatorship. So basically, Alex kind of deflected about the situation and blamed. At first, she acknowledged that the two-part series didn't quite work out. Like, yeah, to say the least. Alex said it's the first video podcast that she's ever made on Spotify, and she was basically just complaining about how much work she had to do because of this. She stated in less than 24 hours of uploading the Jamie Lynn Spears interview that it got 1 billion impressions. Now, it's quite rare for Jamie Lynn to speak out and be interviewed because every time she does, she just gets backlash. So the fact that the podcast painted her out to be a victim and gave her the voice she so desperately wanted is probably the main reason why Jamie Lynn decided yes to be on Call Her Daddy. Unfortunately for Alex though, this podcast backfired. So let's discuss Jamie Lynn for a second and why she is cancelled for those who don't know. Jamie Lynn Spears is Britney Spears' younger sister, and for those who've been living under a rock, Britney has been under a conservatorship by her father, Jamie Spears, since Britney's infamous breakdown 12 years ago. Despite multiple comebacks, Britney's longtime fans have voiced their dissatisfaction in saying the pop star continued to be under a conservatorship at 38 years old. Britney also spoke out about her conservatorship and took her father to court. She exposed all the horrifying things that were taking place in her life behind the scenes. This led fans to launch the Free Britney movement, which brought worldwide attention to the discrepancies surrounding her conservatorship. Jamie Lynn Spears, Britney's younger sister, was also tied into the conservatorship and attempted to defend herself, but fans saw right through the BS. Jamie was doing nothing to support her sister and didn't have her sister's best interest at heart. Britney claimed she wanted to sue her whole family for the abuse she's had to endure over the years. So obviously now whenever Jamie Lynn tries to speak out and defend herself, it's too little too late. Everyone knows the truth and no one wants to hear a bar of it. Going back to Alex's recent podcast, Cancel Call Her Daddy, she discussed the backlash she received from having Jamie Lynn on the podcast. Alex said that there was a shit ton going on online about the Free Britney movement and she wanted to do the interview with Jamie Lynn so she could explain herself and her side. Alex said that initially part 2 of the interview was vague, so she redid it and interviewed for another 30-40 minutes on Zoom, and as she was doing so, more evidence was surfacing online. And basically, I just don't feel like Alex was prepared for this podcast from listening to it. She didn't ask the questions that probably needed to be asked, and when she did ask thorough questions, Jamie Lynn just kind of beat around the bush. Alex said that it says a lot about society when everyone is mad about the interview, but everyone tunes in. She kept going off about how it got 1 billion impressions, and she stated that she asked the questions that she thought needed to be answered. Alex said that she doesn't really regret interviewing Jamie Lynn, and she doesn't care that she gets cancelled, and she's just going to go and interview more and more people. Okay, well that's all very well and good, but what about the effect this interview is having on poor Britney, who just got out of her 12-year conservatorship? Currently, Britney is threatening Jamie Lynn now with legal action because of this podcast and because of the book that Jamie released, and Britney's lawyer is claiming Jamie Lynn is exploiting Britney for monetary gain once again. Alex also said that this is the beauty of media, giving people a chance to speak even if you don't like them. So yeah, obviously Alex doesn't care about getting cancelled from what we can hear. The whole internet is losing their shit and everyone's pissed that Alex and other media outlets are letting Jamie Lynn Spears and Britney's other abusers have a platform. We also can't forget that Alex forgot to mention that Jamie's husband and Britney's dad have been implicated in court documents for taking hundreds of thousands of dollars from Britney's estate. I mean, the list goes on and on. There's heaps of videos online exposing this, but let's break down that two-part interview that Alex had with Jamie, which shows that basically Alex doesn't give an F about the Free Britney movement. So part one of the interview begins with Jamie Lynn painting herself as the victim, as to be expected. She stated that she was an oopsie baby, then went into her dad's problems and how she's always had a bad relationship with her father. Then she discussed her experience being in first grade and her sister taking off in the music industry. Jamie then discussed Britney's mental health growing up and some dangerous things that Britney did. About halfway through part one of the interview, Jamie was already crying and trying to play the victim card. She cried about how she got compared to Britney growing up, etc., etc. She said she couldn't be responsible for everything that happened to Britney growing up. So in part two of the podcast, this is where they dive into the conservatorship. Jamie Lynn said that she's never known anything different than Britney being in a conservatorship, so she didn't know what was normal and what wasn't normal, which is absolute BS. Jamie also claimed that she actually did help Britney to try and get out of the conservatorship and that she never thought she'd get dragged into any of this because in her mind she'd tried to help her sister. Jamie was also out here leaking messages between her and her sister Britney on this podcast, which is a total invasion of privacy. Call Her Daddy definitely gave Jamie the sympathy that she so desperately wanted and a platform she so desperately desired, because at present she doesn't want the world thinking that she's the bad guy after it was exposed all the horrendous things that she and her family put Britney through. So the second part of part two of the interview that Alex had to redo because it wasn't juicy enough for her and it was a bit bland, Alex went ahead and interviewed Jamie over a Zoom call to get more tea. Basically, Jamie had said she'd tried to contact Britney after part one of the interview, but she couldn't get a hold of her. Then the rest of the podcast was just Jamie trying to convince everyone that she had nothing to do with the conservatorship. Blah, blah, blah. Call Her Daddy is losing followers by the minute and people are disgusted with this two-part series. This is beyond disgusting. Call Her Daddy. You're giving a voice and platform to a verbal abuse to gain views and clout by turning it into entertainment when Britney has suffered enough already from her family for over a decade. You are part of the problem. I stand with you, Britney. Jamie Lynn, let's handle this privately, Britney. Also, Jamie Lynn, here's a text message from Britney I'm going to read on a podcast. Jamie had also recently posted this to her Instagram story. Britney, just call me. I have attempted many times to speak to you directly and handle this privately like sisters should, but you still choose to do everything on a public platform. In the meantime, please stop continuing the narrative that I haven't been there for you or that I'm making things up. I'm happy to share how many times I've reached out to you, supported you, and tried to help you. This is embarrassing and this has to stop. Love you. Love you. XOXO. Oh, so what are your thoughts on Call Her Daddy getting cancelled and Jamie Lynn Spears trying to paint herself as the victim? Let me know in the comments.